Today, we're fortunate to begin our series of papers and discussions with a talk by Georg Cleary, who, as you will probably have seen from the publicity accompanying his visit here, once had the opportunity to study with Said at Columbia. More important, perhaps, Georg Cleary, who is now visiting at Yale, where I think and hope you will take up final and permanent residence, so he'll be just a little closer than in Dublin. Professor Cleary is one of those scholars who, in a way, despite Said's own wishes, because Said always spoke of how he did not want follow as a topic that I'm sure we'll fight about over the next couple of days. But Georg Cleary's work both belongs to the tradition of Said's thinking, and in fact far exceeds it in some ways and develops it in different political directions. Georg Cleary is the author of several books and innumerable published articles. I will mention only the most important book titles to you. The book called Partition and the Nation State by Cambridge University Press, which deals with not only the partition of Ireland, but also the partition of Palestine, in order to theorize problems of nationalism, problems of the state, problems of national culture, the competitions between and among cultures in divided contexts. Most recently, he has published a book, or more recently, he has published a book called Outrageous Fortune, which was in 2011. It is a field day book. It has a very intense concentration on the problems of the history of modernity in Ireland, making the relatively radical claim, I suspect, that the political possibilities are much more real and substantive in the high modernist period of Irish writing and culture than they have been more recently, despite the relative grittiness of recent days. But that's enough of me. And so now, please join me in welcoming Georg Luka.
Well, thank you all for coming out. I must begin by thanking Paul and thanking all of the other people involved here, Jonathan and the rest, for the invitation. It's an invitation that I can honestly say makes me feel quite humbled. It's a great honor to be invited here to address so many distinguished Saidians, people who not just knew Edward and worked with him, probably knew him a lot better than I did, but whose work has also engaged with Edwards in some respects more probingly and searchingly than has my own. So it's with some trepidation that I begin. I should also say that I was quite astonished given an article that I published with Boundary 2 some years ago on Seamus Dean. I thought I would probably get at most 10 minutes because I certainly took their patience to a stretch at that stage, but they've indicated to me that I have some time. I hope I won't abuse it too long, or too much, I should say. The book that I want to talk about today, or that will certainly informs my talk, is Said's Culture and Imperialism. As Paul has just said, it's a book that tends, I think, even now, to remain within the shadow of Orientalism, whereas I see it, as Paul has already just anticipated, as an extension of Orientalism. And I want to think about the book not just in terms of its arguments, but also in terms of its interventions with other histories of the novel. And I want to think a little bit not just about the arguments of culture and imperialism, but also perhaps about the form of the text. If we think about the form of literary text, I think we must sometimes think about the form of critical text, certainly those of the stature of Said's as well. So, an admirer of Vico, Auerbach, Gramsci and Foucault, Edward Said was obviously a very historically minded literary critic. Yet he is not commonly thought of as either a historian or a theorist of the novel, I think. Nevertheless, Culture and Imperialism does offer an outlined history of the relationship between the English novel and imperialism. And in the opening paragraphs of that work, Said singles out the novel as the medium most crucial to his concerns. I quote, "Since my exclusive focus here is on the modern Western empires and on the 19th and 20th centuries, I have looked especially at cultural forms like the novel which I believe were immensely important to the formation of imperial attitudes, references, and experiences. I do not mean that only the novel was important, but that I consider it the aesthetic object whose connection to the expanding societies of Britain and France is particularly interesting to study. The prototypical realist novel is Robinson Crusoe, and certainly not accidentally, it is about a European who creates a fiefdom for himself on a distant, non-European island. End of quote. In the major Marxian, feminist, and Foucauldian histories that dominate scholarship on the novel in contemporary times, the rise of the novel is commonly linked to the development of capitalist modernity, the ascendancy of the middle classes, the elaboration of bourgeois sex-gender systems, the business of nation formation, and so on. In these accounts, Europe's relationship to its imperial dependencies have generally featured, if at all, only in very supplementary ways. And thus one of the major achievements of cultural imperialism, I think, was to make imperialism fundamental to future thinking about the development of the modern European novel, something that none of the great historians of that form, such as Lukács, Auerbach, Bakhtin, Watt, Jameson, McKeown, Moretti, Pavel, Gallagher, Gilbert, and Gruber, or Armstrong had ever really done. In Cultural Imperialism, Said insists that the novel performs significant spatializing as well as temporalizing functions. With Lukács' classic work, The Historical Novel, 1936-1937, obviously in mind, Said writes in chapter 2 that, quote again, Lukács studied with remarkable skill the emergence of history in the modern novel, how Stendhal and particularly Scott placed their narratives in and as part of public history, making that history accessible to everyone and not as before only to kings and aristocrats. The novel is thus concretely historical narrative shaped by the real history of real nations. Acknowledging here Lukács' concerns with national popular historical consciousness and the role of the novel in elaborating this kind of historical consciousness, Said insists, however, that novelistic narrative also explores, moves through, and finally endows places with positive and or negative values. Thus he implies any modern history of the form needs to be recalibrated to embrace not just the history and temporalities of European capitalist modernity, but also the spaces or geographies of empire more generally. These remarks lead Said directly into his reading of Mansfield Park, a reading which serves to exemplify the kind of spatializing critical consciousness that he advocates. Now, some 20 years later, this kind of geo-imperially sensitive consciousness that Said promotes in cultural imperialism is, I think, reasonably well established. Put simply, it seems to me that most ambitious undergraduate readers today are probably trained in ways that older generations, certainly my generation was not, to read with an attentive eye for the spatio-symbolic significance of the West Indies or Ireland or India in Jane Eyre, or of Australia and Cairo in Great Expectations, or of Palestine in Daniel Deronda or Ulysses. And to read indeed with a stronger sense more generally of how the Western high arts were incubated within an imperial world system. Cultural imperialism, as I mentioned at the outset, has never provoked the sustained level of controversy that Orientalism has done. But nevertheless, it has certainly, I think, if more quietly, made its mark on the broad contours of the relationship between the 19th century novel and empire, that Said traces through writers such as Austen, Dickens, and Kipling, Conrad, and Camus, and then onto his famous note on modernism. These seem to have become, in fact, something of a normative template for thinking about the novel and empire, a template habitually reproduced, I think, in contemporary surveys and histories of the form. In the paper today, I want to argue that the merits of thinking about the modern novel and empire, by rereading Said and Lukács, and perhaps also Martin Green against each other, to read again contrapuntally. Said may appear in Culture and Imperialism to offer a necessary spatializing, an imperial-minded corrective to Lukács' historicizing the Eurocentric consciousness. But the Said's thinking about the British novel in particular, as it develops from 1800 onwards, continues to be much indebted to Lukács as the historical novel in ways that few scholars have commented on. Moreover, I will also want to argue that when we think about the relationship between the history of the novel and the history of empire, as culture and imperialism challenges to do, we need to take into account, as Said perhaps does not, how the formal mutations and gathering prestige of the novel in the literary field across the 19th century ultimately restructured that field, and in so doing, I would suggest, managed in some ways to change that literary system, a literary system for which London and Paris had served as capitals throughout the 19th century. Said's Culture and Imperialism challenges its readers fundamentally to rethink the relationship between the novel and the empire. And to honour that challenge, I would suggest we need to go back again to works such as Lukács's The Historical Novel, to Martin Green's Dreams of Adventure, Deeds of Empire, which Said cites at the outset of his own work, as well as forward perhaps to work on world literary systems by Pascal Casanova and others. If the novel was as fundamental to the history of Western imperialism as Said argues it was, then we must learn from culture and imperialism, but also learn to move beyond it, to consider what role the novel in the 20th century has played in the unmaking or remaking of the imperial consciousness. If we live in a world in which the modern novel developed within a literary system structured by the old British and French territorial empires, we now live in a world where very obviously new forms of corporate neo-imperialism continue to flourish, then what has this meant for the transformation of the novel? For that matter, what exactly is a post-colonial novel? Or does such a phenomenon really even exist? I think here of Neil Lazarus's quip that in the canon of post-colonial, the post-colonial novel, there has really only ever been one author, and that author being Salman Rushdie. These are large and perhaps even clumsily formulated questions, and they're not questions that Said poses in Culture and Imperialism, nor are they questions which I can fully deal with here today, but they are questions that I want to turn to towards the end of the paper in very speculative and generalized form. Without empire, Said says in Consolidated Vision, there is no European novel as we know it. Quote, of all the major literary forms, the novel is the most recent, its emergence the most datable, its occurrence the most Western, its normative patterns of social authority the most structured. Imperialism and the novel fortify each other to such a degree that it is impossible, I would argue, to read one without in some way dealing with the other. The extraordinary expansion of European power in the modern epoch may have rested on Europeans' industrial and military superiority, but the actual exercise of imperial rule, Said insists, also required the articulation and the consolidation of a particular geographical sense of the world, as well as on the elaboration of what he calls a common departmental view across the various cadres of the imperial elite, a view that allowed them to take a considered long-range measure of colonial affairs. The novel, he proposes, contributed to this, as he calls it, departmental view in a number of ways. In their narratives of adversity and overcoming, the protagonists of the form embody the acquisitive, assertive energies of the emergent European middle classes. Spatially, the form explores, moves through, and endows space, whether domestic or foreign, with confirmatory positive and or negative values, thus articulating various forms of spatial consciousness, or unconsciousness even. Moreover, the novel, Said says, is, quote, a cultural form refining and articulating the authority of the status quo, end of quote. So if we put these remarks together, it would seem that it is the novel's capacity to normalize an idea of moving forward progressively through time, while all the time also organizing various dispositions of space in which the West occupies what we might call a flexible positional authority, though yet retaining at the same time, and Said underlines this, the capacity to test, to revise, or to refine that sense of Western authority. These collectively seem to be what for Said lends the novel's form its particular significance. While cultural imperialism refers to the European novel generally, Said is also assertive on the point that the relationship between the English novel and English imperialism is special or distinctive. The British Empire, he remarks, was not only larger but also more stable than that of any of its rivals, and hence he posits the domestic security of the English ruling classes and their confident sense of global mastery mutually reinforced each other. France, he allows, was a powerful competitor, but suggests that the revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, various restorations and revolutions, 1848, the Commune and so forth, meant that domestic society in France was much less settled than its English counterpart. This, together with the fact that France controlled no single colony whose prestige matched that of India, meant, Said contends, that, quote, the French Empire had a less secure identity in French culture, and only as North Africa assumes a sort of metropolitan presence in French culture after 1870 did France's empire make its presence felt in French fiction in the way that English empire had done in English fiction throughout the century. The rise of the United States introduced another major competitor to English supremacy, but Said contends its sense of imperial mission and global assurance was consolidated more slowly and fitfully, and only becomes manifest towards the end of the century with the annexation of the Philippines. Thus, Said contends 19th century England enjoyed unrivaled imperial reach and, quote, it also produced and sustained a novelistic institution with no real European competitor or equivalent. So he's suggesting there some sort of correlation, I suppose, between the prestige of the British Empire and the prestige of the English novel. I'm not sure if French historians of the novel would agree. The uniquely solid assurance of English culture expresses itself in Said's view in the way in which the empire is consistently referenced in the 19th century English realist novel without ever making its presence felt in any seriously troublesome way. Allusions to empire are ubiquitous, but the empire is nevertheless more or less taken for granted as part of the normative order of things, rather than as something that has to be, by novelists at least, intellectually worried or politically debated. Thus, Said remarks, the world beyond metropolitan Europe is available to the English characters in these novels as, quote, an easily assumed place of travel, wealth and service, end of quote, but at the same time, the colonized populations out there continue to be only a minimally visible presence in English fiction. They remain, Said stresses, drawing on Bruce Robinson's The Servant's Hand, and insistently in the background of realism, as much an anonymous and enabling force as the servants who so rarely appear in individuated reality or in problematized form in English realist narrative. Thus, what Said's reading of Mansfield Park discloses is, as William Spanis has put it, quote, the incredible remoteness, both spatial and psychological, that separates the human victims of the imperial project from the consciousness of those otherwise sensitive and discriminating creative artists of the metropole. The unruffled consolidated vision that Said ascribes to English classical realism is clearly associated with the heyday of the Pax Britannica, stabilized after the Napoleonic Wars. This conception of the novel is therefore, it seems to me, part of a deeper periodizing narrative that shapes and informs culture and imperialism, even though that periodization is never critically reflected on by Said himself. Said does acknowledge, of course, that English realism long predates Jane Austen, and he refers, as I mentioned at the outset, briefly to Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Nevertheless, Crusoe occupies a surprisingly attenuated place in culture and imperialism. It is simply roll called along with other pre-1800 English literary classics such as The Tempest, Spencer's View, or Gulliver's Travels. Culture and imperialism is, in short, never really concerned with the first British Empire, centred on the Atlantic world and coordinated across Ireland, Africa, the West Indies, and the Americas. Though the British and Spanish Atlantic world certainly shadow its opening chapters, culture and imperialism's gaze is always trained on the Second British Empire, and on the period after 1800, when England had replaced the Americas as England's most significant colony. Thus, just as Lukács' The Historical Novel confers foundational status on Walter Scott, and indeed on Waverley in particular, Waverley of 1814, Said's Culture and Imperialism accords a similar foundational status to Boston's Mansfield Park, published in the same year. Mansfield Park receiving an extended and detailed examination that is not, as one might have anticipated perhaps, devoted to Crusoe. Both Said and Lukács, in other words, begin their respective histories of the modern novel, just as a period of major systemic transformation, turbulence, and restructuration, for which the independence of the American colonies of North and South and the French Revolution are signal crises, just as this period of turbulence perhaps was edging towards the settlement of the Congress of Vienna. Now, if we look at the larger trajectory of Said's career, we can easily guess, I think, why matters took this shape. Culture and Imperialism was the long-awaited successor volume to Orientalism, and by beginning with the Second British Empire, Said allowed himself to revisit the concerns of the earlier volume, extending matters now from the scholarly discourses that were the focus of Orientalism into the fictional or imaginative narratives that moved centre stage, at least in the earlier part of the later volume. Secondly, Said now clearly wants to make good the elision of the question or the issue of native resistance, a critique much levelled at Orientalism. His failure to deal with that question is acknowledged as early as the second paragraph of the successor work. And in this sequel volume, Said sees the inability of Western intellectuals or Western writers to take seriously such anti-imperial resistance as one of the major limitations of Western humanist or critical consciousness. Indeed, in what might be taken to be a kind of transference mechanism, he takes Conrad in particular to task for this, in other words, failure to treat seriously resistance to empire, in his new reading of Nostromo. I say new because Said had obviously read Nostromo at length in Beginnings. Moreover, Said is clearly elaborating here, I think, if we look at the structure of his work, a tripartite account of modern cultural history, one that takes us from the establishment of European middle-class hegemony, the period which Said refers to as that of consolidated vision, to the extended crisis and breakdown of that hegemony due to European inter-imperial rivalry, let us say broadly 1870 to 1918, and to the moment after World War I, when the combined force of third world, as we call it, anti-imperial revolutions and post-colonial migrations to Europe and America definitively challenged that old order and established perhaps the beginnings of something new. At the level also of its structure or form, cultural imperialism, it seems to me, is possibly an essentially Gramscian text in its conception of hegemony established, hegemony breaking down or under distress, something new emerging in the form of third world decolonization, and perhaps a new hegemony restored under a neo-imperial US. Thus the volume begins with at a time when a particular hegemonic order is, in Said's view at least, secure and largely unchallenged, an epoch which finds its exemplary expression in the novel in English classical realism. Said then moves on at the other end of the century to an interregnum, when that hegemony comes under stress, the primary literary manifestations of which are the boom of late Victorian imperial adventure novel and the beginnings or the emergence of high modernism. And he closes by documenting the registration of an alternative global vision, its outlines discernible in the works of the poets of anti-colonial national revolutions, Tagore, Yeats, Nuda, and Darwish are cited here, and in the struggle of the works of revolutionary or exilic third world leaders and intellectuals, Gandhi, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, George Antonius, and many others, who challenged Western political and cultural authority and who called into question the long-standing reification of the non-Western subject in European high culture. Curiously, given the importance ascribed to the novel in Culture and Imperialism's opening pages and throughout Chapter 2, it's odd how little that form features in Chapter 3, Resistance and Opposition, where poets like Yeats or decolonizing intellectuals such as Alatas, Antonius, Fanon, Guha, James, and many others are much more prominently to the forefront of Said's consciousness, it would seem. Has Said, in all of this, we might ask, somehow forgotten the post-colonial novel? I'll come back to that later on. If we place Lukács's The Historical Novel and Said's Culture and Imperialism alongside each other at this stage, some telling contrasts begin to emerge. As everybody here knows, I'm sure, Lukács's account of English realism begins with Waverley, as I mentioned, and deals with Scott in generally admiring terms, because Scott is deemed by Lukács to exemplify the mentality of the British middle class in its emergent revolutionary democratic nation-building phase. For Lukács, whatever his personal Tory sympathies, Scott recognises the historical decline of the Highland Gaelic clans and of the old Scottish feudal aristocracy as something inevitable, and accepts the necessity of that transformation. Furthermore, working from a Marxian Hegelianism that is itself a later development of the Scottish Enlightenment stages models of history that perhaps inform the Waverley series, Lukács seems largely blind to colonial matters in this part of his history, at least, and doesn't even stress Scott's Scottishness. He refers to him repeatedly as an English novelist. Said, on the other hand, begins not with Scott, as I said, but with Austen, and reads her as exemplifying the mentality of the English middle class, not in its revolutionary democratic phase, as Lukács does, but already in its settled imperial ascendancy. Lukács admires in Scott his ability to give narrative expression to a kinetic dialectics of historical progression, but is virtually blind to questions of imperialism. Said is alert to questions of imperialism, but sees Austen rather than Scott as the exemplary representative of 19th century English novelistic realism. And he sees empire as something that essentially takes place overseas in India or the West Indies. Thus, neither the internal colonialism of Scotland, if that's what we want to call the extirpation of the Gaelic clan system, nor the manner in which the post-Culloden Scottish and indeed Irish ascendancy aristocracies were recruited wholesale into the English imperial administration, detain Said, since Scott does not really feature in the study. He is mentioned several times. Indeed, because Said begins his account after the so-called swing to the east, his focus is almost entirely on the administrative empires in Asia and Africa, and the business of settler colonialism, fundamental certainly to the development of the first British Empire in the North Americas and to the Spanish Empire in the South Americas, obviously, but also crucial to the development of Australia and South Africa even after the swing to the east. These are relatively lightly touched on. It's not that Said ignores the matter. Settler colonialism does feature in his text. We think, for example, of his reading of Daniel Deronda, but it figures primarily as a French-Algerian affair and in his reading of Camus. The business of slavery, fundamental to the development of so many settler colonies, is registered in Said's Mansfield Park, and thus reminds readers of the overseas horrors of capitalist expansion and progress, if that's what it was, in a way that Lukács's stagist history does not. Beginnings, as Said knew better than most, matter. So what consequences then follow from his decision to start with Austen rather than with Scott, and for the histories of the realist novel that he and Lukács variously unfold? Because it operates in terms of a Gramscian schema of hegemony challenged, hegemony restored, Said's Culture and Imperialism essentially produces a history in which we begin with classical realism, Austen, Dickens, George Eliot, that is eventually followed in the later 19th century by a more unstable interregnum, the literary symptoms of which are the boom of European adventure fiction and European modernism. There is, I think, much in this view that tends intuitively to confirm this broad periodization, but it nevertheless constructs matters such that English realism appears in Said's count to have almost entirely monopolized the literary system throughout the 19th century, thus creating the impression, perhaps, that the English adventure novel or imperial romance really comes to the fore only quite late in the century, sometime after 1870, say, during the age of high imperialism. Said, as I mentioned earlier, acknowledges that the empire had actually featured more centrally in the foundational narratives of Defoe than it does in Austen or Dickens, but he does not dwell on this or make much of it. Indeed, his analysis begins with Mansfield Park, Since his analysis begins with Mansfield Park, his prime example of a 19th century classical realist novel that both assumes and yet represses the existence of the West Indian plantations, moves on to discuss in lesser detail equivalent examples of consolidated vision in the works of Dickens, Thackeray, George Eliot, and other mid-century canonical authors, and then proceeds to consider the closing decades of the century when empire becomes an overt or manifest theme in the works of Kipling and a host of other lesser figures such as Haggart and Henty. This largely gives us the schema that we have here. The trouble with this is that Said effectively writes out the whole ongoing history of romance and adventure forms in English fiction in the long stretch between Defoe and Kipling or Conrad. And this matters, I think, because English engagements with empire seem to have been transacted throughout the 19th century, largely through these adventure romances, rather than through the classical realist novel as such. To put the matter another way, after Defoe, the imperial romance genre only suffers again in Said's account in the works of Stevenson, Kipling, Haggart and others, when, and this is crucial to Said's argument, an optimistic sense of English assurance is said to survive in these genres, even as that same middle-class assurance flags or even collapses precipitously in domestic English realism. The collapse is evidenced for Said by those stalled Bildung or naturalist narratives such as Zola's Nana or Hardy's Tess and Jude the Obscure and so on, in which the European protagonists fail to win out over life's obstacles, and disillusion and disenchantment increasingly prevail. Here, Said very obviously rejoins Lukács again. The idea that the European novel splits after 1848, its domestic line tipping on the one side towards the disillusioned irony of Flaubert's Madame Bovary, and on the other towards the frank imperial exoticism of Salammbô, comes directly, as Said himself acknowledges, from the historical novel. However, the question I want to ask is what would happen to our conception of the history of the English novel, were we to treat romance and realism not, as Said does, as sequential, as part of a before and after classical realist narrative, but as a coterminous term, as tandem forms that develop dialectically across the 19th century, and that are equally integral to the development of 19th century European fiction and its relationship to empire. Wouldn't this suggest that 19th century English realism is essentially a form that can really only thrive within the juridical constraints or imaginative horizons of the nation state, and that the work of narrating the empire therefore has to be farmed out largely to non-realist genres such as the Gothic, the picaresque, the imperial romance, and so on. In his study of the adventure novel, Dreams of Adventure, Deeds of Empire, Martin Green had started from precisely this conundrum. The empire, Green notes, is missing from the great tradition of English realist fiction. As Said very powerfully, I think, shows with great verve that this is not the case. It's not missing, it's simply not in the foreground. It's not as absent as Green imagines. But Green argues that empire is a pervasive presence from the 18th century onwards in the much less prestigious genre of the adventure novel. Defoe's major contribution to the adventure tale in Robinson Crusoe, Green argues, was to modernize it by transferring the emphasis from acts of questing and military heroism valorized in the medieval or chivalric romance to the values of self-making, self-mastery, I should say, hard work, technical ingenuity and colonial settlement that Crusoe personifies. The wandering knight of pre-capitalist chivalric romance ventured across an atemporal and non-historicized world, a world numinous with a sense of the marvelous, and proved himself in battle or quest. Robinson Crusoe's value system, Green argues, is much more mercantile and much more time-conscious. Crusoe survives on his island by virtue of his rational, prudently calculating, self-reliant approach to this alien environment, and he overcomes adversities by means of exceptional self-discipline, as well as modern tools and techniques, the guns, compasses, diary-keeping, accountancy practices, and other modes of secular knowledge that enable him to mentally subordinate the tropical landscape and its cannibal inhabitants, as well as its European renegades, to his will. Inspired by English compilations of early modern sea voyages assembled by Hakluyt and Purchas, Defoe's works metabolizes these forms into a narrative of Puritan spiritual biography and colonial settlement, steeped in a mercantile value system radically different to the military aristocratic one that had formed early medieval romance. This is all Green's argument. Popular from the outset, Defoe's novel was, Green tells us, widely translated, especially by the Huguenots in France and by Protestant writers in Holland, Germany, and Switzerland especially. It was also taken up by Rousseau in Emile, which emphasized the importance of practical as opposed to literary training for young men, and which singled out Robinson Crusoe as the only book boys were to read before the age of 17. Maria Edgeworth, for her part, in Practical Education, counsels against Robinson Crusoe as reading for boys. Its adventurism, she argues, breeds too wayward a disposition for the youth to be good training for youth. Thus, before Defoe's Robinson Crusoe seems viewed in this context, Robinson Crusoe seems a decidedly curious text in formal terms, belonging on one hand to the worlds of romance and travel narrative which make up so much of the text, a worlds for which the great world beyond England and Europe is essentially either a place of wonder, captivity, or speculative adventure, belonging on the other hand to the world of realism, in which the world beyond Europe actually ceases to be a landscape of wonder and becomes a place that has to be methodically settled and civilized, mainly by narratively quite monotonous daily labors and routines. For Ian Watt, Robinson Crusoe may be the great inaugural text of English realism, but it might better be viewed, perhaps, as a picaresque combination of travel literature and romance that morphs into realism only when Crusoe, having completed his many wanderings across the world from North Africa to Brazil, is shipwrecked on his island and can travel no more, and thus has to settle. Narrative realism, this might suggest, thrives best in delimited space, the space of the island kingdom, whether overseas or at home, and is essentially a sedentary mode. It seems to me that in some respects in Robinson Crusoe there is a fundamental tension between travel and settlement, that in some respects the controversies generated by his work about these things are actually inherent to the work itself. Nonetheless, Green argues, although Robinson Crusoe was exceptionally popular and continuously republished not only in Protestant London, but also was popularized in the US when incorporated into the writings of Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Smiles, Defoe was marginalized in the Augustan literary system by the anti-modernizing, anti-mercantile, somewhat anti-imperial High Anglican Swift. And he was elevated above Swift, and while he was elevated above Swift by Coleridge as part of the Romantics' efforts to displace Augustan classicism, Defoe was dispensed with afterwards in a now romantic-inflected English literary system for which Robinson Crusoe's Puritan realism was all too leadenly prosy and unimaginative. Too insistent on the virtues of mercantile tradesmen and the colonial settler over the aristocrat in the Augustan age, too realist again in the Romantic age, Defoe, for Green at least, was always popular and continuously republished, but never really consecrated into the most prestigious ranks of the English literary system. Just one more few moments with Green. For Green, the next major innovator after Defoe in British adventure and romance is Walter Scott, whose Waverley, he argues, transfers the locus of adventure from a tropical outpost of empire to a colonial periphery, located at a historical rather than a geographical distance, the Scottish Highlands of 60 years since. In Scott's hand, there is a reaction against the mercantile value systems embodied in the Defoe version of the genre, and the values of chivalry, aristocracy, and military virility are accorded at least some sort of qualified restoration. In the Scottian adventure tale, the Hanoverian world of commercial and mercantile value will always triumph, but never without registering a sense that something of worth has been lost with the defeat of the primitive clan societies associated with the Scottish Highlands and with Britain's domestic colonial frontier. In Green's view, which is quite at odds with Lukács's on this score, the Scottian version of the adventure tale is therefore aligned with what he calls the value world not of the reforming English middle classes, but with the values of an aristo-military caste, whose social function in domestic English society was being gradually eroded as England became an industrial nation in Victorian England, but which nevertheless remained fundamental to the 19th century aristo-administrative elites that governed the British overseas empire in Asia and Africa. Quote, England's accession to world power and the spread of her empire created a need for governors and generals and ambassadors, and so a demand for stories like Scott's, which provided a fanciful, energizing myth for an aristo-military caste. Green essentially has a kind of argument here where the adventure novel, banned from the highest echelons of prestige in England itself, finds its readership essentially in the colonies. Not just in the colonies, but finds, I suppose, its most powerful readership in the colonies and among an aristocratic class, which is also losing out in this modernity. Whether one agrees with Lukács, for whom Scott's novels give narrative flesh to a dialectical conception of history, something which for Lukács constitutes a major gain in novelistic technique and sensibility, or with Green, for whom Scott represents a recuperation of an aristo-military value system that was functional primarily for classes that rule the overseas empire, Scott's centrality to the history of the novel and empire can hardly be doubted. The modular nature of the historical novel is a well-worn theme. It gets taken up in the US, Latin America, Russia, and almost everywhere. And even Said, who, as I said, largely bypasses the form, mentions in passing how the Cairene-based Lebanese novelist Firji Zaidan developed the Scottian historical novel for modern Egyptian fiction in the early 20th century. Still, I want to ask if both Defoe and Scott, each great innovators of the novel, each of whom devised their own particular combinations of romance and realism that were to be extraordinarily generative, both at home and internationally, if each can be intimately, if diversely linked to the business of empire, this compels us to wonder not only why Said's skirts boat, but also perhaps why some later Victorian figure did not manage to build on what these had already achieved to fashion a prestigious high realist novelistic empire of empire. Something equivalent, let us say, in status to George Eliot's domestic epic, if we can call it that, Middlemarch, a novel of provincial life. In the United States, again, it's a commonplace to say that Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking series, modelled on Scott's novels, established the adventure and frontier narrative of central genres to the American literary system. And at the other end of Europe, or the Euro-American world, Tolstoy, as Lukács recounts in the historical novel, essentially transformed the historical novel in War and Peace into a great classical realist national epic. For Lukács, what matters about Tolstoy is that unlike developments in France or England, the historical novel no longer remains a genre, but is married into the realist novel itself. Novels and tales of empire set in all of the outposts of the British Empire continue to pour from the English press from the time of Scott to that of Conrad. But the English novel of empire remains a rather calcified literary form that was never technically developed in narrative terms to keep pace with the innovations introduced in domestic English Victorian realism. Thus, the form remained at the level of what Conrad and Lord Jim would call light literature, and there was never to be a great English epic of empire in the mid-19th century, when Britannia ruled the waves, and when the British realist novel as a genre was perhaps at the peak of its prestige. So I've been outlining here three different histories of the English novel, three rather different conceptions of England and its middle class, three different conceptions also of its evolving literary system. Said's Culture and Imperialism proposes an English middle class establishment so solidly assured of itself, so confident of its domestic and international rule throughout the 19th century, that it could more or less take the empire for granted, even if it remained a nagging unconsciousness, that empire only becoming visible after the scramble for Africa's sake. For his part, Green's dreams of adventure suggest that the 19th century English middle-class novel and its literary establishment was essentially a Little Englander one, temperamentally hostile to the business of empire, which it conceived as either a mode of upstart capitalist modernization, inimical to the interests of landed wealth in some quarters, or quite the opposite, viewed as a predatory aristocratic enterprise overseas in others. But both dispositions, Green supposes, temperamentally hostile to adventure fiction, since its values were neither those of a Burkean rootedness in settled tradition, nor in trade or evangelical Christianity. The literary establishment, suspicious of empire, Green suggests, squeezed the mold from the outset to the margins of non-serious children's literature. For his part, Lukács sees the middle class as largely progressive in temperament in the early 1800s, when it was still taking on the aristocracy and still widening, however modestly, the reach of democracy. But for him, 1848 marks a moment after which a once progressive middle class becomes increasingly conservative and racist, even decadent, surrendering its Enlightenment values to a crassly imperialist social Darwinism and later to fascism. For Lukács, this crisis of progressive thought, as it splinters into either a Whiggish veneration of blind mechanical progress on the one side, or into discourses of degeneration and decline on the other, produces a crisis of realism. This crisis, of course, leading to naturalism and its descriptive objectivism, and to modernism and its introspective, world-denying, solipsistic subjectivities. Green ignores the classical realist novel in his study because for him the adventure novel is the only form that consistently engages the business of empire. Said focuses on canonical realism and contends that it has a hitherto unnoticed imperial unconscious, but more or less stops short in his account of the modernist moment, but I want to return to that later. So, 3 different histories, 3 different senses of the middle class and its fate, 3 different conceptions also of the literary system. My concern here is not really to decide which of these histories is the more correct, but to allow them to illuminate and perhaps to unsettle each other's presuppositions. But I do want to note that there are some real issues at stake here. Firstly, both Said and Lukács tend to see the English middle class as a singular and coherent block. Only Green proposes an English elite divided into various aristocratic and industrial fractions, perhaps at odds with each other as to what the primary purpose of empire should be: evangelization, trade, conquest, pragmatic modernization. And only he proposes the notion of a multi-leveled, mutating and always contested canon, which these various classes invest in their different ways. Secondly, we might also wonder whether the stability which Said argues gives birth to the English realist novel, Secondly, we might also wonder whether the stability which Said argues gave the English realist novel its stately assurance might also, not in time at least, have stymied its formal innovations and fostered what Seamus Dean once called insolent provincialism in the English novel. A novel like Moby Dick, we might speculate, was possible in the United States, which had a less well-established literary system, but which was also in the process of becoming a messianic imperial nation-state and an incipient world power, but in which the memory of an 18th century Enlightenment Republican revolution still carried a powerful contracharge. But in an England which imagined Napoleon to be a modern predatory imperialist, a new Alexander or Caesar, and which saw itself not as an empire, not before Victoria was made empress at least, but as the anti-imperial guardian of European peace and the guarantor of incremental reform as opposed to revolution, we find no major novelist with a radically inflamed republican and religious imagination, equivalent, say, to that of Blake's. Nor, on the other hand, was there any Napoleonic invasion of England, though there were several half-hearted French missions to do so through Ireland, or some grand national repulsion of same as there was to be in Russia to spur a patriotic realist epic equivalent to War and Peace. It is arguable, perhaps, that in Culture and Imperialism, Said overstates the coherence of the English ruling classes, and arguable too that the stability he stresses levied a tax of sort on the English realist novel that utterly crippled its ambitions in some ways. I've been stressing the limits of English realism and its incapacity to produce a Victorian epic of empire. Nevertheless, in Conrad's Nostromo, the English novel did perhaps achieve such an epic, one with something of the sweep and scope, the narrative and perspectival complexity, the psychological sophistication and visionary ambition equal to that of the domestic realism of Middlemarch, or of the American and Russian mid-century classics Moby Dick and War and Peace. In that panoramic work, Conrad recapitulates nearly the entire history of modern novel forms: the conquistador legend, the quest for buried treasure, the castaway tale, the romance, the historical novel, the adventure novel, the industrial novel, even the national allegory. Combining these genres perhaps only so that they mutually cancel each other. Progress of a sort does come to Sulaco, but it ultimately neither frees the territory from foreign dictate, brings peace or satisfaction to its inhabitants, nor resolves domestic conflict. So foul the sky clears not without a storm seems to sum up that novel's conception of history. An accurate prognostication, whether we read Nostromo as an allegory of the South American or European continents. Anxiously looking over one shoulder to the inevitable rise of US corporate imperialism, and over the other to the equally inexorable rise of organized labor, Nostromo exemplifies the hoary old adage, but hoary for a reason perhaps, that the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk. For the first time since Scott, the English novel of empire in Nostromo seems to embody some dynamic sense of historical consciousness, some acutely complex temporality of combined and uneven development. But with the attainment of this historical consciousness comes the foreboding that England's day, like Charles Gould's, is nearly done, that the US corporate organization and Russian revolutionary combination are the twin forces which will govern the future, and that in this emergent world, the lands beyond Europe are destined to become either backward badlands ruled by populist despots like Guzman Bento, or wealthy but subservient satrap states like Sulaco. The difference, of course, between Scott and Conrad is that in Scott's hand, the historical novel had recounted a narrative of historical transition and subscribed to the idea, however qualified or hedged, of qualitative progress. Thus, in Nostromo's case, however, any humanly reassuring sense of historical progress has become nearly another broken idol, since it has been reduced, by left and right in Conrad's view, to the play of material interests, to the triumph of reification. In formal terms, the paradox of Nostromo, it seems to me, is that in typical classical realist fashion, it is a national allegory, the story of a single nation, Costaguana, but that with its cast of European, Amerindian, and African characters, obviously not in the same level of development or depth, it's also a national allegory. It also tells the story of a nation, which seems to be a synecdoche for a continent. As if, in other words, the caterpillar of the English realist novel is trying at last to mutate into a transnational post-realist butterfly. Written by an assimilated Pole and published in 1904, the year that Henry James also published The Golden Bowl, a novel that anticipates the transfer of empire westwards from England and Europe to the US, the year also in which Joyce sets his Ulysses, English realism yields an epic novel of empire. Just as both empire and realist novel, that empire and realist novel slide towards another world systemic crisis, World War I, that will mark the beginning of the end of the 19th century versions of empire and realism alike. And in a short final section, I'd like to go into the period of modernism. I will do so in very schematic terms, so I hope you will bear with me, but we can perhaps tease out some of these issues in discussion afterwards. What happens to the relationship between the novel and empire after World War I? Cultural imperialism, as I signaled earlier, offers relatively few clues. In a recent article on Said, Timothy Brennan has contended that Said, quote, shared with Lukács a major career undertaking to supersede the esoteric formalism and anti-populist hauteur, the hauteur of high literary modernism. So Said, he argues, essentially has a populist conception of literature, which is, although he allows it, he's not Lukácsian in many senses, which fundamentally makes him a sort of fellow traveller with Lukács on this account. This Lukácsian anti-modernism seems at first glance most unlikely given Said's regard for Adorno and high musical modernism at least, though the brevity of a note on modernism, as well as Said's recurrent reluctance to press matters of the novel much beyond Conrad, might seem to support Brennan's thesis. However, again, we'd have to qualify that by remembering Said's studies of T.E. Lawrence, Camus, Mann, and Yeats. In any event, Said's note on modernism is more nuanced than Brennan's account would allow. Modernism for Said shares with the late 19th century adventure novel a sense of rapid European geo-imperial expansion, but also with European naturalism an increasing sense of disillusion. Thus, modernist forms display both a widening supranational vision, which shows itself in the emergence of what Said calls new encyclopedic structures, but also a propensity towards structural circularity and temporal stasis. Modernism's defining feature, Said says in that note, is its irony. Its new will to inclusiveness is habitually mediated by irony, and, quote, it substitutes art in its creations for the once possible synthesis of the world empires. Here, the totalized modernist form serves as an aesthetic or formalist substitution for the disintegrating totalization of the nation-state and perhaps of the 19th century European worldview more generally. So realism is associated with assurance. Modernism represents for Said something of a turn to art when that sense of totalization or global view can no longer be sustained outside of art. Perhaps, but let me offer very briefly and schematically a more controversial hypothesis. The late 19th century European novels since Flaubert had not just bifurcated, as Lukács contends, into a disillusioned naturalism and a frank exoticism. Madame Bovary versus Salammbô, Jude the Obscure versus Treasure Island or Kim. It had also been propelled, hadn't it, by Baudelaire and Mallarmé in poetry, and by Flaubert and Huysmans in prose, and in the drama by Wilde's Salome, towards a kind of heroics of style. In the case of the novel especially, this meant a repudiation of realism, an attempt to shake off perhaps the form's bourgeois origins and functions, as the novel sought to ennoble itself, to give itself in literary terms perhaps the equivalent of a knighthood, to recover something of the dimensions of epic, and to elevate itself above the obligations of mimesis, and in so doing to reposition itself in the cultural field as a higher art object. Or to put the matter in Bourdieuian terms, the modernist novel attaches itself in the hands of Henry James, Joyce, Proust and others to an avant-garde project that attempts to blast open a new and hitherto unavailable position within what had been the available field, within the settled field of 19th century literary positions. This leads to a restructuration of the inherited 19th century literary system with a corresponding devaluation of realism and adventure literature alike, both now meant to seem more old-fashioned and less serious than before. And where the Anglophone literary world system, centred as it had been since modern times, as I said earlier, on London, obviously on Paris as well, but we're talking about the Anglophone system here, where this is concerned, this development is led not by English writers, but by emigre Irish and Americans. Beginning with the migration of Henry James and also Neil Whistler, although he's not a novelist, from the US to London in the late 19th century, at a time when Wilde, Shaw, George Moore and the young Yeats from Ireland had also migrated there. These later followed, of course, by Pound from the US, and Eliot, and then by Joyce and Stein, who find their various ways to Paris. The takeover of the European literary metropoles by these passionate pilgrims from the peripheries is, in literary historical terms, extraordinary. By the 1920s, Yeats, Pound and Eliot had established themselves as the leading poets in English, perhaps, or certainly were content to represent themselves as such. And Eliot, not only as poet, but as magisterial critic, is already on his way by then to becoming the Pope of Russell Square, and thus to attaining, for a foreigner from St. Louis, an unprecedented authority as the leading arbiter of English literary taste, something which no outsider or interloper manages, I think, to do to the same degree in Paris. And in their different ways, Henry James and James Joyce each shatter what Seamus Dean calls that insolent mediocrity and emphatic provincialism of the 19th century English realist novel. The American opening its field of vision outwards to Europe and America by means of what we still call the international scene. The Irishman by turning it into a comic mock epic which parodies the exhaustion of available English and even European literary styles, but also which makes the empire not the subject of narrative, not the subject of plot, but the topic of intellectual reflection, something which Said would do in Culture and Imperialism. In other words, in Joyce's hands, the empire becomes a problem of cultural inheritance, as it remains for Said. Pound, of course, with his usual braggadocio, or should we call it frankness, made it no bones about it in 1929. I'll quote, "British literature was kept alive during the last century by a series of exotic injections. Swinburne read Greek and took English metric in hand. Rossetti brought in the Italian primitives. Fitzgerald made the only good poem of its time that has gone to the people. Morris translated the sagas. The Irish took over the business for a few years. Henry James led, or rather preceded, the novelists, and then the Britons resigned on block. The language is now in the keeping of the Irish, Yeats and Joyce. Apart from Yeats, since the death of Hardy, poetry is being written by Americans. All the developments in English verse since 1910 are due almost wholly to Americans. In fact, there is no longer any reason to call it English verse, and there is no present reason to think of England at all. We speak a language that was English." It's in the New York Herald Tribune in 1929. For Pound, the Englishness of English literature is already all over. The Irish and American interlopers have, he contends, not so much renovated the English language as created something altogether strange and new. We speak a language that was English, he declares, as though British English is already a dead tongue, and the modernists had fashioned something more cosmopolitan medium to replace it. As Pound tells it, the Irish had their chapter in this grand reversion colonial invasion narrative, but his is essentially a tale of American triumph and takeover. All the developments in English verse since 1910 are due almost wholly to Americans, as English is taken firmly into American custody. And he wasn't wrong in some respects. The Americans would take, if not English, certainly modernism into custody after World War II. Were we to take Pound seriously here, and I propose that we perhaps might, we might say that the Irish and American modernism was in effect the first post-colonial literary revolution, and a successful one at that. Successful both because it brought into being a new kind of literature, more transnational in its ambitions at least than the old, and because that literature was of a technical and intellectual ambition and range sufficient to what we might now call provincialised English literature, and to diminish London's capacity to offer itself as the fixed and absolute centre of the Anglophone world. After all, it is in this post-World War I period too that Dublin, but especially, of course, New York, emerged as new cultural capitals in their own right. The long 19th century colonial deference to London's literary authority now finally diminishing in both places. This is, of course, a highly ambiguous post-colonial literary revolution, because the US is already on its way to becoming a new imperial metropole, the world hegemonic power of the 20th century. And after its war of independence, Ireland, not unlike Costaguana, is partitioned, fights a civil war, economically stagnates, and once it's won its independence, reneges on its republicanism, thus anticipating after its own First World manner some of the more negative contours of Third World post-colonial history still to come elsewhere. So what kind of literary revolution was American and Irish modernism? Patrician in many respects, of course, the product in both instances of fractions of an old but now declining Protestant elite. Though beneath that patrician upper crust, we mustn't forget Joyce in the one case, or the Harlem Renaissance in the other. No revolution is singular, and neither was that of modernism. After the Hiberno-American sack of literary London, if I can exaggerate a little, the English realist novel does not disappear, of course. But now suddenly the empire becomes a continual, upfront subject of English realism in a way it never was in the 19th century. As though they were seized by a sudden wanderlust, the more ambitious English writers now suddenly want to be anywhere, it seems, but London. The two Lawrences, T.E. and D.H., lead the charge, the one becoming a legend of the Middle East, never to resettle comfortably in England afterwards. The other roves the world from Ceylon through Australia and then settles in New Mexico, setting the plumed serpent against the backdrop of the Mexican Revolution. And after Lawrence there followed Green and Lowry, whose major works, The Power and the Glory and Under the Volcano, were also set in Mexico. From British India we get obviously Foster's A Passage to India, Orwell's Burmese Days, Robert Godden's Black Narcissus, from Africa such an unlikely creature as War, Black's Mischief, Joyce Cary's Mr. Johnson, Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter, from Jerusalem, Olivia Manning's The School of Love, 1951, later the Levant trilogy, from Alexandria, Lawrence Durrell's The Alexandria Quartet. One could go on and on. Why now? Why the sudden visibility of empire in its decline? Said's cultural imperialism might suggest that once the consolidated vision begins to come asunder, then the empire can no longer be taken for granted and has now to be morally engaged. Lukács would surely say that the unremitting pessimism of this body of fiction is simply the long tail end of the Western middle class's loss of any sense of enlightenment or meaningful emancipation. Martin Green tells us that these works owe little to the English domestic realism of Austen, Dickens, George Eliot, or Hardy. Rather, he says, they are all Conradian versions of the English adventure novel, a form which is an adventure novel which has now lost faith in both adventure and empire, but which can, for that reason, Green suggests, be elevated at last to the status of serious fiction. In this sense, for Said to stop at Conrad seems entirely reasonable. These later writers are all perhaps Conradian in one way or another, although we might want to look at some of the women novelists there. One might also want to add, though, that the British post-World War I's novel's exodus to the outposts of empire is not just a flight for London or a flight after primitivism, it is also a flight from modernism, especially perhaps from Joyce's effort to make the empire not a narrative of either conquest or decline, but an intellectual problem, a conundrum of cultural inheritance. Has the non-Western novel continued on and done this, made empire a conundrum of cultural inheritance? It seems to me that Frederick Jameson is broadly right in his suggestion that most novels written in the former Anglophone colonies are national allegories, or else contestations perhaps of national allegories. Where the Hiberno-modernists emigres provincialised London with their outrageously and extravagantly cosmopolitan forms, the West Indian, South Asian and Arab and other emigres have perhaps tropicalised it. London, in the most ambitious Anglophone novels of recent times, let's say Rushdie's Midnight's Children's, Walcott's Elmira's, which might be considered a novel of sort like Ulysses, Gauche's City of Poppies or River of Smoke perhaps, we get new versions of James's International Scene, now neither perhaps so patrician upper crust nor so restrictively Euro-American. However, it also has to be said against this that the revolutionary fire of the days of James and Fanon no longer charges Anglophone post-colonial fiction any more than that of Marx or Lenin. Jefferson, King, or Connolly fires English, Irish, or American fiction. The Hiberno-American modernists came to the fore just as the old capitals of the European literary system were shaken up by the rise of New York as a new, quote-unquote, world city and cultural capital. Perhaps as New York now begins to cede ground to Beijing, Rushdie, Gauche, Marquez, Bolano, and all the rest will seem like post-colonial Dickens, Eliot's, or Hardy to us in years to come. And as Beijing becomes the new New York, and Delhi its Dublin, or vice versa perhaps, a post-colonialism that will dwarf the accomplishments of Joyce, Yeats, Eliot, and Pound may already perhaps be in the offing. Lecturing on Irish literature and history to a nationalist-minded Italian audience in an Austrian-dominated Trieste, in May 1907, Joyce told his Italian listeners, quote, "We Irish," Oscar Wilde said one day to a friend of mine, "have done nothing but talk, and we're the greatest talkers since the days of the ancient Greeks." I know you can be agreeing with saying not the greatest, just the longest. But though the Irish are eloquent, a revolution is not made from human breath, and Ireland has already had enough of compromises. If it finally puts on the show for which we have waited so long, this time let it be complete, full, and definitive. But telling these Irish actors to hurry up, as our fathers before us told them not so long ago, is useless. I, for one, am certain not to see the curtain rise, as I shall already have taken the last tram home. However, in this instance, Joyce was wrong. He had not taken the last tram home, either to Hibernia or to heaven, when the Easter Rising volleyed around the British Empire in 1916. And in Ulysses, he himself had the discipline to turn the water of Irish talk into the wine of something greater than talk. Edward Said has sadly taken the last tram home from his American exile. But the Arab world that always fired his passion, as Ireland fired Joyce's. In that Arab world today, the talk is not of the end of history perhaps, but of the end of the American empire.
thank you for that. I just had two small questions or comments and then a larger question. Did I hear correctly earlier on you said you listed Lukács, Auerbach, Watt, Jameson, several other figures who had studied the novel, and said that none of them had approached the issue of dependencies or peripheries before Said had?
I said that none of them had made the question of empire so central to their histories of novel, to their histories of the novel as Said had. It's there in various ways in many of these histories, but I think what culture and imperialism did, and I think the achievement has been underestimated, frankly, is to just put it right in the center of the discussion of the development of the novel.
I guess I would argue that Jameson's political unconscious did that very centrally well before Said.
In what way?
Taking the issue of that very division between romance and realism, or realism and modernism, the last chapters on Conrad. I think Said even acknowledges that to those.
Yeah, I think there are certain ways in which, in my reading at least, Jameson's The Political Unconsciousness, the governing term is capitalism. I have no argument with that. It seems to be as important a term as imperialism. So I think in some ways, if my memory of it is correct, it's really an empire becomes, and I think remains in Jameson's later work, even on his essay on modernism and imperialism, which is focused primarily on Joyce and Foster. Imperialism really becomes central to Jameson's discussion of the novel in the late 19th century period, in some ways as it does in Said's, and around the figure of Conrad and around the figure of European inter-imperial competition. I think by, as I said in the talk, taking it back to what he considers at least to be the beginnings of English classical realism with Austen, that Said makes it fundamental to the question of realism as well. So I think there's a development on Jameson there. And I also think that, I didn't talk much about the second half of the book because my interest for this paper was primarily on the novel, but I think there are ways in which Said, in that second half of the book, takes it beyond, just the contradictions generated by late 19th century expansionism or by inter-imperial conflict, and makes the whole question of, novel and empire, or at least culture and empire, as the title is, fundamentally in a way that I don't think Jameson does. I mean, Jameson does in other ways. I wouldn't see it necessarily to sort of play the two off against each other in a one-upmanship kind of way. Right. I wouldn't certainly want to devalue Jameson's account, but I was looking at Pavel's history recently, and it's really remarkable in some respects, to the degree to which it's hard to unsettle that idea that the history of the European novel can be largely told without, with the empire simply at the edges of it. So I suppose what I was trying to do there was underscore what I think is important about cultural imperialism.
My other question was, you characterized how Anglo-American modernism is the first to overtake Metropolis, or the literary establishment of Metropolis. What would you do in the case of Spanish-American modernismo, which emerged late 1880s, early 1890s, and overtook Spain and parts of Paris well before that?
I would be inclined to pass because simply not expert enough in the debates to be able to give you a plausible answer to that, but I'd say it's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I think again, it's just with a sort of passing knowledge of that whole literary history, it seems interesting to me that were you to take, as I was suggesting, the history of the earliest European empires, Britain and Spain in North and South America, and to focus more on what happens to the novel in these settler colonies in the 19th century, then it's interesting, I think, the way in which the novel in those sites is continuously developing so in some ways, if you were to make that argument that modernismo in Latin America is already beginning to challenge its European centre, I would say in some ways that would support the kind of argument that I'm making, rather than would complicate it in interesting ways, but it would also support it in interesting ways.
The talk was beautiful. I just wanted to put two things on the table. They don't really require much comment, but just poetry, your talk is so comprehensive that it does have a kind of a totalizing thrust to it, and then, which kind of mirrors the thrust of the novel to take over the entire world. And yet, there's no poetry here. Now the novel isn't poetry, but I just wonder about comprehending the world is something that epic poems do. And epic poems, and I'm just thinking about Milton, and where you got the advantage of having both, the good guys and the bad guys are huge right there. So we have the imperialists and the anti-imperialists right there, represented. That's wonderful. Okay, so another note is about, you didn't say almost anything about Germany. And I'm thinking about that you did mention Baudelaire and Flaubert, and I'm thinking about the impact of Baudelaire's, once again, poetry, Flowers of Evil, on a writer like Walter Benjamin, and the kind of literary writing that he does with his Berlin childhood. Now this is really not, you didn't comment on this, I'm not complaining that you didn't do that. Just say, if you put Germany, which certainly was an imperial power, at least it hoped to be. Now it's failed in the way the Berlin childhood is like a flower of evil that arises out of the crash of the Germany in World War I. But it's just a comment.
Well, I mean, even in the things that I did cover, I'm very conscious of the fact of walking on thin ice of my knowledge at times. So to try and cover German would be a stretch. The question of poetry is a really interesting one. I tried to just barely allude to it with the figure of Blake, who seems to me to be just such a hugely interesting figure. I suppose I'm culpable of, like many post-colonial critics, people who are interested in the question of post-colonialism, guilty of a certain kind of novel centrism. If I could stretch it beyond just apologies, I suppose I would say something like, I've been thinking recently about the question of epic. I taught a graduate course on it last year, and the novel. And I don't particularly find Moretti's way of thinking about modernism and the modern epic plausible. What's interesting perhaps about the poetry in the 19th century, if the scholars of that can be relied on, is the way in which so much of it is failed epic, or conceives itself from the start as failed epic. And obviously that's to do not just with questions of society and imperialism, but also to do with the relationship between novel and poetry, which is, as sort of, if you like, competing literary forms or competing modes of writing with each other. I would have to just say your fundamental point is absolutely right. If one were to write something like a comprehensive history of European literature and empire, to leave poetry out would be a disaster. It is a fundamentally important form. I think you'll have to do it better than me.
So let me thank you for a really rich and dense and erudite talk. I found myself very stimulated by it. I have one small question of clarification first. Am I right? You may have said the wrong word and I might not have understood, or one of the other. So did you say something about Lukács 1848 is when the middle classes become racist? Or were you speaking the word realist, perhaps? I mean, I genuinely don't know. I have a question mark. I have that phrase and then
Again, if I remember Lukács, what he's arguing is essentially that European in a fairly schematic way, that the European middle classes have a, by and large, for Lukács, progressive role until 1848.
Yeah.
Progressive because they are continuously sort of pushing out the bounds of democracy in various ways by challenging the ancien regime. He argues that once the, I suppose, the failures of the democratic revolution, rebellions or insurgencies, whatever, in 1848, and later the turning, as he sees it, of the European middle classes against the incipient labour and socialist movements, for Lukács that represents the beginning of the intellectual, political and moral decline of the European classes. And he does have interesting, Lukács doesn't seem to pay that much attention to empire, but he does have increasing references, again if I recollect, in that latter part of the 19th century, where he's talking about social Darwinism, the rise of racist ideologies in Europe. And he's writing this, of course, it has to be borne in mind, in the 1930s, where he's very much conscious of that.
So I heard correctly then,
Yes.
is what you're saying. Okay, fine. That's actually very helpful to me, and I will, I'm sure at some other moment ask again about that. The questions that I have two parts to them. One has to do with Nostromo, which I find an extremely interesting novel, and which I would dispute with you is a realist novel. That is, the notion of reading many things for realism, I'm very sympathetic to, but there's altogether far too much fragmentation and irony, all of the hallmarks of modernism. I would suggest that that would put Nostromo on the other side of the divide, were you to recognize the divide. I mean, I would also suggest that it is, a story of fundamental failure. That is, there's, as you say, there's a kind of progress that comes to Costaguana to Sulaco, but it's technological progress, right? There's no democracy. The ruling Criollo mestizo classes are absolutely undermined by the end. The man who comes to develop a sense of his working class self, subverts that. And I've forgotten the name, Decoud, of suicides, of all sorts of things that line it up very much more with modernism than with realism, unless you wish to propose a very different definition of realism. I know that's at some level what you're doing, but so that's one thing. So I'm proposing to you modernist adventure. That is, and perhaps that works and perhaps not. The other question I have to ask sort of sharply or simply, because there's just too much for me to understand fully what you're doing. If I get what you said, you're using, and I don't know green, I must admit. So you're using Lukács to challenge and extend Said for a fundamentally Saidian reading of modernism. Am I understanding that correctly?
So say that part again.
Lukács
Yeah.
is for you one of the tools by which you extend a Saidian reading of modernism. That is, fundamentally you believe, at least you suggest at the end, that modernism allows one to see, to represent, that some of the possibilities that modernism offers are greater, some of the disillusionments are richer and more apt or more appropriate to the situation. But the thing is that while certainly you offer a very useful historical account of realism, my sense is, as one moves forward, as you suggest, why is the visibility of empire in its decline? It's because that decline takes place at a certain literary historical moment, if I understand the thrust of your talk.
Okay. There's no dispute at all between us, I think, on the question of Nostromo and failure. Of course, it's absolutely a novel about failure, as you say yourself, at almost every level. And that was how I was reading it, that it's a novel, I was suggesting, which had a kind of complex sense or consciousness of combined and uneven development, which perhaps the historical novel had, at least according to Lukács in its early stages. But that I pointed out that one of the differences is that, whereas in writers like Scott, there is a sense of qualitative human progress, we might now find that questionable, but that's what Lukács believes. Nobody could argue that about Conrad, because his whole point is that material interests, whether is the fundamental thing that the left and the right share in common, it can be considered a conservative critique, but that's his critique, the rule of reification is what's South America's destiny, but only because it's the destiny of everyone. The question as to whether it's better categorized as a realist or modernist novel, or as you say, an adventure tale turning into modernism, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, the adventure modernism dynamic, because of course what Said and Lukács share is precisely that sense that the modernism and the adventure novel, the very high and, if you like, the very low in terms of literary esteem forms, actually have more in common with each other than might be realized. Lukács, because he negatively marks modernism. Said, Brennan thinks that's what's happening, but I was trying to suggest Said's a bit more careful. I think the note on modernism is actually very tentative. I'm not sure if Said is sure himself exactly where he wants to put modernism in this story. He essentially wants to say, I think, that he makes, by making the category of irony central to his account of modernism, he is essentially saying that if there's a critique of empire here, it's very carefully mediated by irony, and it's essentially a kind of aestheticizing critique, and that the more overtly political critique will come later with the actual colonial subjects or decolonizing subjects. So that more political critique comes after modernism. I was suggesting, obviously, working with and maybe to some degree against Pascal and Casanova, but there's something more interesting story to be told about modernism and empire there, certainly than Lukács tells, and maybe even perhaps more than Said tells, that there's a way in which I don't think I would want to make that simply a story about irony, or a story about sort of retreat into art as aesthetic consolations for the totalizations which can no longer now be sustained perhaps at the level of intellectual discourse or whatever. But on the other hand, nobody can disregard the extraordinary sort of reactionary politics of a great deal of modernism, so it is a complicated question. Is Said Lukácsian on the question of modernism? Was that part of your question?
No, it was that you were Lukácsian in reading Said in order to ultimately extend Said.
No, I hope not. I do want to.
I mean, I don't think of it as, you're not killing Said, you are indeed extending him. That's a sort of simple way of putting it on my part.
I'm not at all trying to, downgrade its importance, and I certainly don't see myself as doing something that's intellectually more important. So that's not the trust of the paper. The trust of the paper is that by putting Said, Lukács, and Green alongside each other, we allow perhaps each of them, allow ourselves a way to think about each of them perhaps more diacritically than we could by just taking our cues from one of them. I give Green a lot of space because he is perhaps still the person who's had the temerity to sort of write a long history of adventure and the adventure novel. And I think, Said, all of these critics, it seems to me, have major accomplishments to their work. Said, precisely because, I didn't make much of it today because I was trying to push on a little bit beyond it, but Said, precisely because he makes empire so fundamental to realism. Lukács, because he's interested in the question of time, Said, space, but also then Green, just because he's interested in that damn old adventure novel, which maybe should feature in any account of all of
Yeah.
We have kept our visitor for a very long time, but I'll allow one more question if it can be short. If not,
So what was formerly novel about the novel form that allowed it to correspond to Empire in the early 19th century?
It was formerly novel about the novel that would correspond to Empire. Well, I tried to say something about that in the passage where I think Said talks about what, just some of the many things that single form could do. Develop new kinds of temporal consciousness, develop new kinds of spatial consciousness. I think it's very important for Said that it's not just simply a reflection of establishment thinking, but it also has, for all its sort of assimilation of both temporal and spatial consciousness that might be said to be partially, at least outside of the novel, but also that it has a critical function. And I suppose what's novel about it is precisely that at the level of narrative we get these variety of different things. I do think that that's a very successful kind of formulation in culture and imperialism. I do think it's a way, allows Said a way to think about the relationship between the novel and Empire without simply reducing it to a kind of base superstructure kind of problem, or simply to reducing it to a kind of handmaiden of Empire. The critical function that he ascribes to the novel is significant, I think, in his work. It's something that he stresses, maybe he feels the need to stress a great deal, but so I guess that's my answer.
now would you please join me in thanking Professor.